Our next presenter is a journalist, another journalist from the Philippine Daily Inquirer. He's a recipient of the Philippine Daily Inquirer Scholarship. Yeah, and he graduated magna cum laude from the University of the Philippines in 2016. He is likewise, at a very young age, awarded the Michael Koenig Young Journalist Bursary, receiving a week-long internship at the Cannes Lions International Festival of Creativity in Cannes, France. May I present Mr. Matthew Reysio Cruz.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you again to FNF for having me today. Can I have the first slide, please? So as Carrie mentioned, my name is Matthew Reysio Cruz, and I'm a reporter for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. So I'm going to be speaking today about disinformation and free speech and how we should sort of be approaching this in the time of the coronavirus. One of the main beats that I cover as a reporter is education. So before we tackle disinformation in the time of COVID, I wanted to sort of take us back a bit to a month before the virus even really started showing up in the news cycle here. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of the biggest stories that I covered last December was the results of the 2018 Pisa, or Program for International Student Assessment. So this is a achievement test taken by 15-year-olds globally. And when the results came out in early December, it sort of turned the country inside out overnight. A lot of people really saw it as a watershed moment, not just for the education system, but the country at large, because the results of the test really were quite dire. Can I have the next, please? So the results of the test showed that among 79 countries that took it, the Filipino test takers were the last in reading and were ranked second lowest in math and science. So as I kept reporting on it, there was one statistic in particular that I continued to go back to that really sort of left an impression on me, largely because it was really illuminating in a lot of ways, even though it was quite overlooked in a lot of the coverage on the test. So on average, worldwide, only 8.7% of test takers demonstrated the ability to distinguish between fact and opinion. So bear in mind that this is the OECD average. OECD is the administrator of the test. So these are not just developing countries. In fact, this 8.7% figure includes education systems in some of the most developed countries that we have around the world. But it gets even worse when you zoom in on country level data. So in the Philippines, this number was 0.1%. So essentially 0.1% of our test takers in the Philippines sort of showed this skill or demonstrated this skill that's associated with being able to tell fact from fiction or fact and opinion. Next slide, please. So anyone with a Facebook account will hardly find this as a surprise. The use of disinformation and our susceptibility to disinformation is well documented in the Philippines and has been since 2016. But I think that it should at least do a lot to sort of shift our perspective as we try to figure out how to address disinformation and how to analyze it. Because so as the rise of disinformation globally has been felt acutely here, as the Philippines is often referred to as a petri dish for the tactics of information warfare that eventually find their way into Western democracies. So for example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2016. So I think that when we think about disinformation, there's a tendency to focus on or hyper-focus on the bad actors that produce it. But I think that it's important for us to keep in mind that fake news isn't just about Chinese troll farms or Russian cyber warfare. In a sense, it's really the failure of everyday systems, so education, health, economic, to really equip citizens at the most basic levels to deal with the vast information that's available to them. So, in a way, it's the way that people consume disinformation that gives it its potency, that really makes it as powerful a weapon as it is. So disinformation is powerful because our people have been uniquely underprepared to handle it. So it is important to address disinformation on the content level, which is where most of the conversation tends to rely or tends to center on. But we can't rely on content moderation alone. Because it's, in a way, it's sort of like a game of whack-a-mole in the sense that once we figure out how to really address one form of content, a new one will just be cropping up. So it's really always sort of playing catch up to that. In order to really address disinformation, it's a systemic problem that requires an equally systemic response. Next slide, please. So the pandemic has made even more clear how poorly disinformation has been addressed in the Philippines. The Director General of the World Health Organization, as early as February, said that we're not just fighting an epidemic, we're fighting an infodemic. So this is just the abundance of both factual and misleading and fake information present on the virus. And the virus has laid out such fertile ground for the spread of false information because it amplifies chaos, it amplifies confusion, but at the same time, our traditional gatekeepers, or the people who are sort of at the front lines of trying to manage this disinformation. So this would be your media, fact checkers, content moderators, have sort of been forced to recede from the conversation, which provides even more fertile ground for disinformation to be spreading. Because, for example, here, media are required to have a pass from the PCOO to be able to report. Facebook has sent home its human moderators, so it's had to rely sort of on its computer algorithms to police content. So this really sort of lays down the groundwork for an atmosphere that allows disinformation to spread very rapidly. So here, as we can see, Section 6 of the Bayanihan to Heal Us 1 Act penalizes individuals or groups creating, perpetrating, or spreading false information with up to 2 months in jail and a 1 million peso fine. So that would be the maximum. So this is sort of, we can see that this is the way that the government has reacted to the very real problem of disinformation. I guess just to look back at fake news laws in general, these aren't new to the pandemic. To some people, it may sound like a reasonable way to tamp down on this very real problem of disinformation, especially when the stakes are so high, given that it's a matter of life and death when you're receiving the wrong information in the time of the virus. But in 2016, in the wake of this sort of hyper-awareness about disinformation and its impact on our democracies, the European Union studied it and issued a very comprehensive report in 2018. And on that report, they explicitly argued against the regulation of disinformation with these quote-unquote fake news laws, because these are generally seen as a solution that has side effects potentially worse than what it's trying to address. Of course, it hasn't stopped countries from trying to pass and enact fake news laws. Time and time again, it's been used to suppress critics and dissidents. So in Egypt, in Singapore, in Cambodia, actually just in Cambodia, 17 have been arrested for coronavirus-related news, including members of the dissolved opposition party. And then in Turkey, we would see that at least 93 suspects allegedly responsible for unfounded and provocative social media comments about COVID-19 have also been identified. So, whether or not the arrests do happen in authoritarian settings, just the existence alone of these types of laws could really have a profound chilling effect on the media landscape. So it could lead to self-censorship. It could also make sources less likely to be open. We can see here that in the wake of when this law was passed, a joint statement, a group of media organizations issued a statement denouncing the law and saying, we'll leave it up to the government to be the arbiter of what is true or false, a prospect that can't invite confidence, given the fact that many administration officials, including the chief executive, have been the source of disinformation. Interestingly enough, in 2017, there was a Senate committee that actually floated the idea of passing a fake news law, but it was President Duterte himself during that time that said that that kind of law would be tantamount to censorship and wouldn't be able to pass. So we can see now, just 3 years later, the environment or the atmosphere that the virus has created has sort of opened the door to autocratic leaders or would-be authoritarians. It's sort of given them this permission or opened the door to pass these laws that we might find less palatable in other times. So next slide, please. So the reality of what's happened since the lockdown has started has really only further cemented what are these concerns that rights groups and press advocates had when it was passed. So we can see that the PNP has arrested at least 32 people between March 9 and April 5 for sharing news on social media that quote unquote caused panic among people. And these suspects hailed from all over. There was from Luzon, the Visayas, Mindanao. Next, please. More than a dozen subpoenas have been issued by the National Bureau of Investigation, also over posts on social media. And the thing about both the PNP arrests and the NBI subpoenas is that we know close to nothing about the full nature of what this alleged fake news was. In the PNP press release that they issued to the media about the arrests, there was no information given on what kind of information it was that these people were allegedly sharing that allegedly caused panic. So, this is really reason to suspect that it's not only that it's not just disinformation that's being targeted, but legitimate criticism. So as with the drug war, the administration is hoping it can substitute real policies with brute force. The efforts that we can see that have been taken since the lockdown started, especially when they are taken in the totality of the government's sort of fraught history with free expression, it really leaves little doubt that state agents are cloaking the criminalization of free speech in this sort of benevolent premise of a war on disinformation. But going back to the drug war and even in the government's response to the coronavirus disease, it is always sort of its fallback position has always been to rely on fear, to rely on force. But just like the war on drugs and just like COVID, the government cannot fight disinformation based on an expanding menu of penalties alone or even at all. Going back to what I mentioned at the start about the results of the Pisa, it's really, that widespread inability to process information, which is the result of institutional failures that sort of amplifies the messaging in disinformation. A lot of the reporting that came out of China at the start of the spread of the disease showed that suppressing criticism and stifling the press never makes a society safer, even though that has always been the sort of grand bargain of authoritarianism, right? The idea that we can trade our civil liberties for security, for safety. But we're seeing now with the coronavirus disease that illusion is sort of collapsing because the reporting has showed that had China not engaged in censorship of information, which included threatening doctors, whistleblowers, journalists, it's possible that its citizens would have been more prepared and taken better precautions that would have limited the spread. I think that, I guess, just to close, one country that's very instructive in the fight on disinformation is actually Taiwan, which has also been a model in fighting COVID itself. Because the government of Taiwan, and this has been verified by civil society organizations in Taiwan as well, found that there was a vast disinformation campaign in Taiwan that could be traced back to China, not necessarily the state, that hasn't been proven yet, but the source of that disinformation was China, and it had all sorts of disinformation. It was trying to say that the government was concealing the real amount of infections. It contained like this fake confession from a legislator revealing that the government had been doctoring its information. So there was just this really big flood of disinformation. But optimistic, or in something that can give us hope, is that it actually the impact of that on how people have responded in Taiwan has actually not been very great. And that's because Taiwan is sort of used to dealing with disinformation from China, dating back to its past elections. So it's sort of been able to develop the appropriate response to disinformation. And we can see that it's sort of the complete opposite of what our government has been engaging in, because the biggest tool that they have used against disinformation is just their high level of transparency and responsiveness. And we can see that when the government is filling the vacuum with reliable information, constant reliable information, that definitely helps to blunt the impact or the potency of disinformation. So Taiwan has taken measures to facilitate communications with the public using social media to deliver policy goals. They've employed chatbots online, which is a WhatsApp-like platform that's used in Taiwan to announce policies. They release these policies and statistics on a daily basis. Statistics about infections are readily available. So we can see that this also better informs the media outlets there. And when media is equipped to better inform people, the citizenry is also less likely to engage with disinformation. And we can see that Taiwan has also actively engaged with its civil society. So it's partnered with NGOs, with tech companies, to really tackle disinformation in a systemic way. And I think that the efforts of the Taiwanese government in this regard have really overall heightened the sense of vigilance in the public when it comes to disinformation. And I guess so, just going back to what I mentioned at the start about education and the Pisa results, we can see that discernment, or this ability to separate fact and fiction, is really intimately connected with education, health, socioeconomic power. So the response to disinformation, while focusing on the content level, is important. Again, it has to be equally holistic. So that means training our public school teachers to be media literate, but also paying them fair wages. It means grappling with our alarming rates of child stunting and malnutrition. It means an economic safety net that can stop kids from dropping out. So especially in this time of crisis, right, we have to vigorously reassert the need for more and never less speech and expression, because the health of our people and of our democracy really rely on it. So thank you again to FNF, and thank you everyone for listening.